Okay, hello everyone. We might get started. So, welcome to this joint ISBNPA and ISPAH webinar. Oops, I'll just get rid of my restart. That would be no good. All right. So, I'll just start with a quick plug. So, ISPAH are always looking for ideas for new webinars. So, if you do have an idea that the ISPAH Early Career Network could run, and perhaps more specific to early career researchers, then please do get in contact with the email address listed on screen there. We also do a little plug. There are existing ISPAH and ISBNPA webinars that are located on the website. They're hosted on YouTube, so you can just freely access those. And you can see all of the past webinars that we've done. So today we're using Zoom. So all participants, you can all relax, you're all on mute, but you can write your questions in. And we request that if you can please use the Q&A function as opposed to the chat. The Q&A is slightly better, and it will allow us to get questions to both of our speakers today. We'll actually hold off asking them during the presentation, and we'll collate them all together here and get them to you at the end. So today's webinar is on the topic of peer reviewing, and we've got Professor Russ Jago and Dr. Jenna Hollis. They're going to cover slightly different bits of the content today. Jenna is going to start, and she's going to look more of the basics of how to write a peer review and peer review etiquette, and also discuss some of the benefits, where Russ is going to then come in and talk about what editors want from a peer review and what makes a good review and how to respond to it. And then we'll finally wrap up with some questions and discussion at the end. We've got an hour allotted, so we may well run for that. But both the speakers are going to allow some time for questions at the end, and that's us good to go. So I might introduce Jenna if she wants to take over the screen, and we'll collate all of your questions together.
Okay, so hi everyone. My name's Jenna Hollis. I'm a postdoctoral researcher from Hunter New England Population Health and also a conjoint lecturer at the University of Newcastle, Australia. And as Tepi mentioned, today I've been asked to provide a little bit of an overview on peer reviewing from the perspectives of a reviewer. So just bear with me a sec. I'm just trying to get my presentation to move on. There we go. Okay, so in terms of what I'm going to talk about today, I've really developed my presentation to outline 5 different questions. So firstly, what is peer reviewing? What is the process for peer reviewing? How do I write a peer review? When should I be peer reviewing, and why should I peer review? And I really developed this presentation based on my own personal experiences with peer reviewing, as well as advice that other people have given me along the way. But in terms of developing your own style of peer reviewing, I'd really encourage you to talk to other people and find out a little bit about their perspective, but also reflect on your own practices to develop your own style. Where possible, I've tried to be as practical as possible and give you some examples. And I've tended to use examples based on the International Journal of Behavioural Nutrition and Physical Activity, just because this is the journal I tend to peer review for. So in terms of what is peer reviewing, essentially it's a process whereby researchers or your peers evaluate the quality of other researchers' work. And it's to ensure that the research is scientifically rigorous, the messages are coherent, the information or the study is novel and innovative, and it really builds on what we already know. And the peer reviewing system is used in a variety of different settings in the research environment. So it's used for scientific journals, for grant applications, in terms of when you submit a conference abstract to a conference, and also in the PhD thesis reviewing process. But for the purpose of today's presentation, we're really just going to focus on the process of peer reviewing for journal articles. And this includes original articles, reviews, and short reports. So in terms of the process of journal peer reviewing, it's a system to assess the quality of a manuscript before it's published. So an author of an article typically submits a manuscript to an editor who then screens the paper and determines whether they'll send it on to reviewers, or they may reject it at this stage if they feel that it really falls outside the scope of the articles that their journal's interested in. If they do send it on to reviewers, this can vary, in my opinion or in my experiences, it's varied in kind of the health journals. Anywhere between 2 and 4 reviewers can review one manuscript. They'll then provide feedback, which the editor uses to assess the review, and the editor will then determine if the manuscript is accepted, if it's rejected, or if they're recommending that the author makes revisions to the manuscript, in which case they'll convey that back to the author. The author then can either make revisions or amendments to their manuscript, or they may rebut some of the comments that the reviewers have made. And this information goes back to the editor, who will then provide this rebuttal or this response back to the reviewer, who will then have another chance to review the response document and review the manuscript again, looking for some of the edits that have been made, and will again provide feedback back to the editor to help them make their decision. And this process will keep going on really until the editor has sufficient knowledge to make a decision as to if the manuscript is ultimately going to be accepted or rejected. So there's a couple of different types of reviewing systems. So it might be a single blind review where the reviewer knows who the authors are, but the authors don't actually know who the reviewers are of their article. And this is the case for the IJBNPA journal. It might be a double-blinded review where neither the reviewers or the authors know who each other are, or it might be an open review where both the reviewers and the authors know of each other's identity. So I thought I'd just step you through each of the different kind of steps of the process of actually reviewing a peer review right from the beginning. So typically you'll receive an email invite from the editor, and the email should include the name of the journal, the name of the editor who's inviting you to review, the title of the manuscript, and also often the abstract of the manuscript, which will help you decide whether you will peer review it or not. You'll often receive a time period that you have to consider the invitation to review. So in the case of this email, they gave me 7 days. Or you also should receive the time period that you have to actually review the article. And in my experience, this is anywhere between 1 week to about 2 months. But in the case of this invite, I was given 21 days. They'll also give you instructions on how to go about submitting your review once you've finished it. So at this stage, you essentially need to make the decision whether you want to accept or reject the offer to review. And in making this decision, you could reflect on things such as whether you have the right amount of time to actually review the article. If you feel like you have a conflict of interest, which might make it inappropriate for you to peer review the article, or if you feel like you have sufficient expertise to review the article. And you can then use the links to convey to the editor whether you're going to accept or reject that offer. If you reject it, many editors also ask if you can recommend other reviewers who might have appropriate expertise to peer review the article. If you do accept the article, often then you'll receive a confirmation email, and in that email will then give you the link to the full manuscript, the link where you can submit your feedback, and it'll also highlight the due date that the review is due back at the journal by. So I've just taken the example of the ISBNPA journal in this case. So once I've logged in, you should open to a reviewer main menu where you'll be able to see the number of assignments you have pending. And if you click on that link, it'll then take you through to a table which will provide an overview of all the assignments or the peer reviewing assignments that you have pending. And from this link, you'll be able to view the entire submission of the manuscript that you're being asked to review. You can provide your recommendation, and you can also contact the editor if you need to. So you've now accepted an invitation to review. What happens next? So the next few slides I've really developed based on my own approach to to peer reviewing, and you may have a different approach, but this is essentially just the steps that I take when I peer review an article. So I start by reading the reviewer instructions and get a better understanding of the journal aim and the scope. So the journal will generally give you a list of criteria about the kinds of manuscripts that they're interested in publishing. So in the case of the ISBNPA journal, their criteria is that it fits the scope of the journal, it's methodologically rigorous, and also that it's a novel study. It's also really important at this stage to get an idea of whether there are any other reviewer questions that the journal's asking you to comment on. So in the case of this journal, they're asking me to comment on the level of interest I think that the article has, as well as the quality of the written English. You can also get an understanding here of the type of format that the editor wants the feedback in. So they might ask you to upload an attachment, or they might ask you to directly write your comments online, or they might ask you to fill in a form. So getting a good understanding of the format for this feedback can save you a lot of time down the track. So once I've got an understanding of these instructions, then I do a first read through of the manuscript. And this is essentially a skim read. And I'm basically just trying to get an initial impression of the manuscript and get an idea of what my likely recommendation is going to be. So even though it's a skim read, I'm still making sure that I read the full manuscript, the tables, the figures, and the appendices. And I'm trying to essentially answer 5 different research questions. So is the research question relevant to the journal? So does it meet the scope and the aim of the journal? Is it novel, and how does it actually advance the field? Is it methodologically sound? So here I'm not looking to see if I think that they're missing important detail in the methods section, but I'm looking to see if there's flaws in the methodology which I think can't be resolved retrospectively. So this might be if I feel that the study design is inappropriate to answer the research question, if I think that they've used discredited methods of assessment which shouldn't have been used, or looking at issues in their sampling procedure. I'm also looking to see if the conclusions are consistent with the findings of the study, and they've also considered the limitations of the study when reaching these conclusions, making sure that the study isn't overstating its findings. Finally, I'm looking to see if the paper's well written, so is it clear and easy to understand? And the aim of this first initial read is really to identify if there's any major flaws in the manuscript early on. And I personally find this saves me time in kind of scrutinising the article in detail from the beginning. So based on answering those questions, I try to come up with a summary paragraph in the beginning. And this really forms the basis, or the first paragraph of my peer review. So in this summary paragraph, I'll provide a brief summary of the purpose and the aim of the manuscript and also the findings. And that's really for me to convey to the editor what the main aim of the study was and what the main findings were, but to show the authors that I understood what the study was about. I'll then go on to summarise the strengths of the study, and I do this even if I think that I'm going to reject the paper or recommend that it's not published. I'll also then go on to look at or summarise the weaknesses of the study, and also the areas that I think that they could improve on. And I'll ultimately provide a recommendation, whether that be not to publish, to revise the manuscript, or to accept the manuscript. And I've provided just an example there of what I might write. So in this case, this article investigates the effect of a secondary school behavioural intervention on adolescent diet and physical activity levels. The intervention improved physical activity but not diet in comparison to the control group after 24 months. While the article is well written in terms of style and grammar and the authors should be commended for their long-term follow-up, I do not believe it is suitable for publication in the ISBNPA journal. There are a few key reasons for this recommendation, including the small sample size and non-valid methods of dietary assessment, which I'll explain in more detail below. So then I'd spend the next 2 or 3 paragraphs really explaining what I think some of those weaknesses are, providing a rationale for those, and clear supporting evidence, including citations where possible, and also where possible, providing recommendations for improvement as well. So I'd use this same summary paragraph structure, whether I was recommending that a review be rejected or accepted. So in this instance, I've included another example of what I might write for a paper that I recommended small revisions to. So essentially the purpose and the aim is the same, but I might then write the article is well written in terms of style and grammar, and the author should be commended for using objective physical activity measures and the long-term follow-up. With some minor revisions, I believe the article will be of great interest to the ISBNPA readership, and I have a few key suggestions which I believe will improve the overall clarity, particularly with regards to the methods and the statistical analysis. So that's the summary paragraph, and from there I then go on to provide a little bit more detail and some more specific feedback. So in terms of the second reading of the manuscript, so if I feel that the article would likely be accepted, or if I feel that I might be asking for minor or major revisions, I then do a second read of the manuscript and I try and make detailed comments as I go. So I start by reading the background or the introduction, thinking about, does it set the scene or does it provide an appropriate context for the study, especially considering that some people that might be reading it in the future may not have a good background or understanding of the topic to begin with. Does it summarise the existing literature, and is this summary balanced, or do I think that they're missing any key evidence or key studies to provide a balanced background? And making sure that this evidence is all up to date as well, so they're citing the latest evidence. Looking to see if they're providing a clear rationale for the study or the paper, so whether they've addressed a gap in our understanding or a gap in the evidence, so that the study's making a clear contribution to the field. And I'm also looking to see that they've clearly defined their research question and their aim, and they've stated hypotheses if relevant. I then move on to reading the methods of the manuscript, looking to see if standard reporting guidelines have been followed, so PRISMA, Consort, the TIDIA checklist, or STROBE, depending on the study design. I'm also looking to check if I think that ethical standards have been maintained, so if appropriate, have they sought ethical review of their study? Has the trial been registered or the review been registered if necessary? Checking that to make sure that the health and the safety of participants, if there are participants in the study, haven't been compromised along the way. In terms of the level of detail, I'm looking for a clear description of all processes, interventions and comparisons, and essentially asking myself the question along the way, could I replicate the study based on the information they've provided me? So have they given me enough information that I could go and repeat this myself? Also providing a justification for the procedures that they've used. So, for example, providing evidence for valid and reliable measures. I'm also looking to see what statistical analysis they've used and if I think it's appropriate, and also looking to see if they've provided a power calculation if needed. I then move on to the methods section, looking to see if the findings of the study actually answer the research question, and checking to see if the results are correct. So looking at the figures and the tables and the descriptions in text to see if there's any errors or incorrect interpretations of the data. I also look at then the figures and tables to make sure that they're appropriate, making sure that they're easy to understand and accurate, and that if I was to look at the table or the figure alone, that without the manuscript, I would still understand it. So it's a standalone piece of work. I then move on to the discussion where I look to make sure that the main findings of the study have been discussed in the context of other research and our knowledge, making sure that they've acknowledged the limitations of their study, and also commenting on the generalisability of their findings to other populations and also other contexts, and looking to see if they can suggest ways that future research can either confirm the findings or move the research forward in some way. So for a lot of journals, it may not be compulsory or mandatory to have a conclusion, but if it is, I'm looking to make sure that the conclusions are supported by the findings or the results of the study in the context of the limitations. So they're not overstating their findings in the conclusions, and making sure that it provides us a good summary on the importance of and relevance of the study and its contribution to the field. At this point, I would think that I'd have a fairly good understanding of the full manuscript, so then I might go back and read the abstract and checking to see if I think the abstract provides a good summary of the full manuscript or if it's missing any key detail. I think a really important point to consider here, though, is that a lot of abstracts have really tight word limits. So if you are going to make suggestions of how they could add more detail, then it could be helpful to also suggest where they might be able to save some words and cull them from their manuscript. I'm also looking to make sure that the keywords that they've used actually reflect the content of the manuscript, or if I could provide any other suggestions of keywords that they could use. Looking at the title, making sure that it accurately reflects the main purpose of the paper, but also that some journals require specific or have specific instructions for the title of manuscripts. So, for example, the ISBNPA journal recommends that you include the study design in the journal title for some studies where appropriate. It's really important not to forget about the other sections of the manuscript at this point. So I'd go back and have a look at some of the funding information and the conflict of interest statements to make sure that I don't think that the results of the study have been biased in any way, or some of the funding or conflicts of interest have influenced the results. And I'd also have a quick look through the reference section of the manuscript just to make sure that appropriate citations have been used, that the citations are up to date, so they're providing evidence based on up to date or the latest manuscripts, the latest evidence, and then not missing any key references from the field. I then reflect on the overall manuscript, thinking about the organisation of the manuscript, whether it has a logical flow, and if it tells a nice story and if it's easy to read. Thinking about the length, so is it concise or are some sections too wordy and long? And also reflecting on the readability of the manuscript as a whole. So I'd recommend not rewriting the paper. I don't think that is really the job of a reviewer, or not correcting typos, even though it might be challenging to let them go. But if you do feel that the readability is a problem, then making a general statement about that in the peer reviewing comments. And if it's a serious problem, then recommend that they seek language editing services before it's resubmitted back. So from this point, once I've got a really good understanding of the whole manuscript, I use the notes that I've made to write a really detailed feedback response, which I'd put under my summary paragraph. And the format for that response for me really depends on what the journal requires, so what their reviewer instructions are. So that might be that they want you to chronologically list all of your feedback from top to bottom, or they may want you to list that feedback under major or minor headings. One, I guess, really important detail that I'd encourage you to do is be really specific in your feedback. So this is just an example of feedback that I received as a reviewer on an article that I had written. And the reviewer had said the authors have done a poor job in writing the methods. So as an author, it was really unclear to me with what that I had done a poor job with, where in the manuscript they felt that I had done a poor job, why was it a poor job, and how I could fix it. So in getting that feedback myself, I'm now really aware of providing specific feedback to authors where I can. So I try to make sure I include the following key points when I'm providing specific feedback to authors. So I try to show them where I find the issue, to orientate them to that section, giving page and line numbers where appropriate, or even if there's no line numbers, giving them a paragraph in a page. Showing them with what I have the issue with, so make sure you highlight what the issue is. Give a reason as to why that's an issue, and then if you can, provide them with suggestions on how they can fix it or how they can improve the problem. So I've put an example up there of a response that I might write. So on page 3, line 12 to 20, there's key detail missing from the description of the dietary assessment measures in the methods. This is important to confirm that appropriate procedures have been used and to provide the reader with enough detail to replicate the study if needed. It would be helpful to add some detail on the procedure for administering the food frequency questionnaire and indicate how missing responses were dealt with. Please also report on the validity and reliability of the measure in the population, including supporting citations. So in this example, I've tried to be really clear about, what I thought the problem was and how they could go about fixing it. So once you've got to this point, you're essentially ready to submit your peer review, and just a reminder to reflect on the format that the journal has asked for that peer review to be received. So you'll be asked to provide your recommendation, which could be minor revisions, declare any competing interests that you have. So they'll generally give you a list of questions or things to consider when you're forming that statement. And even if you don't feel that you have any competing interests, you may be required to state something along those lines. There'll also generally be a section where you can provide comments to the author, and those comments are viewed by both the author and the editor, and also an area where you can provide confidential comments to the editor, so the author won't see those comments. So I would make sure that I provide my summary paragraph and any detailed feedback I have in the responses, in the comments to the author, but in the comments to the editor, I might comment if I felt that I didn't have appropriate expertise to comment on a particular section of the manuscript, such as if I felt that I didn't fully understand the statistical analysis and it was a little bit too detailed for me, and I might recommend that the paper undergo an additional statistical review. Or if I thought I had any issues in terms of felt that there may be any conflicts of interest on the behalf of the author. You may also ask to indicate if you're happy to re-review the article if the authors are asked to revise the manuscript. So just in terms of peer reviewing etiquette, these are just some tips I've picked up along the way. I think it's really important to be timely as possible. So that's both in terms of accepting the offer or refusing, and also in terms of reviewing the manuscript. And if you do need an extension because you don't think that you can complete it in that time, then make sure you tell the editor that. And this is really important because I think we've all probably found frustration with a slow publication process. So just make sure you're not contributing to the problem and that you're making those decisions as quick as you can, and getting the feedback on time. I found it particularly helpful to block out time in my diary to dedicate that to peer reviewing or set a reminder in my calendar. I think it's also really important to be professional and be kind to each other, making sure that you're using appropriate language and feedback. So for me, as a general rule, I don't write anything that I wouldn't feel comfortable saying to someone's face, or I don't write anything that I myself wouldn't want to receive as an author. Also, try not to ask for self-citations of your own articles, or don't contact the authors directly. Make sure that if you have any questions about the manuscript, that always goes through the editor. And where possible, try and be helpful. So providing specific feedback and suggestions on how you can improve, or how the authors can improve their manuscript. So in terms of when you should start peer reviewing, to my knowledge, there's not any specific date that people should start. For me, I started in the last year of my PhD once I'd written 4 or 5 articles in the field. One of the questions I often get asked is how do I get asked to peer review? For me, it happened automatically once I started publishing a couple of articles in the field, particularly once I published a systematic review in the field. I started to get asked to peer review a lot of manuscripts that fell under that topic. Also, make sure your details are up to date in the journal system. So this includes your contact details, but also any keywords that are associated with your expertise. Talk to your supervisors or experienced colleagues so they can suggest you as a reviewer. Or you might talk to people who are already on the editorial boards of particular journals and let them know that you're available and you're interested in peer reviewing. But I'd also suggest that you try not to reject an offer if you do get it, because you may not get asked again. So only really reject an offer if you feel that you don't have the time or it really falls outside of your expertise. So in terms of reviewing for the first time, I personally got mentoring from my supervisor. We sought permission from a journal that we could co-review together. So make sure if you do want to go down that line that you do get permission from the editor to both review a journal article, just because there could be issues with confidentiality. You might like to start a journal club in your department where you can practice peer reviewing journal articles that are already published, or some journals actually publish their peer review reports with the manuscript when it gets published, such as BMJ Open. Make sure you're giving yourself enough time to peer review. So in the beginning, I tried to allow myself 2 or 3 days just to reflect on my comments and my feedback. And if there's an area that you feel like you don't have expertise in, make sure that you tell the editor and suggest a specific review in that area. So, for example, if you don't feel like you have appropriate statistical knowledge in that area, then suggest a statistical review. So I'm almost finished, but I thought I'd just talk about maybe some of the benefits of peer. In my opinion, I think it's our professional responsibility, and it really is a core skill as a researcher to be able to peer review other people's work. For me, I've come up with a rule that I use, so it's a 2-to-1 rule. So I try and review 2 papers for every first author paper that I submit. So if I submit 6 papers per year, then I'm really aiming to do 12 peer reviews in that year. For me, I find it also really looks good on your CV, and you can list it under professional involvement or engagement. So I always write something along the lines of I regularly peer reviews for journals, such as of approximately 1 per month, such as IJBNPA and BNJ. It's also a good way to keep up to date with your latest research and sharpen your writing skills. It can give you insight in how to respond to reviewer comments in your own manuscripts that you're submitting. And it's a great opportunity to see other reviewers' comments, because ultimately it's a learning experience. So I'll end it here, but if you are interested in learning more, I'd really encourage you to sign up to our 1-day early career researcher and student workshop, which will be held at the ISBNPA conference this year on the 3rd of June, where the current editor of the ISBNPA journal will be talking about reviewing and publishing backstage. So I might hand back over to Tepi.
Yeah, okay, bear with me. All right, so thank you very much, Jenna. That was really thorough, and you talked us through quite a lot. We've actually got a few questions here, but we will hold out. We'll pass over to Professor Russ Jago, who's going to look more from the journal editor's point of view. Thanks, Russ.
Okay. Is the screen coming through okay, guys?
Yeah.
Just waiting for the slideshow to get going. It seems to be running slightly slow. Is that the right screen up now?
No, just swap it.
Okay. Is that right now?
Yeah.
Okay, so thanks for the opportunity to talk to you. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge Kirsten Davison from Harvard. So Kirsten and I did a presentation on this topic at IJBNPA last year, and I've used some of the combined slides to kind of form this presentation. So what I'd like to do is kind of give you what an editor or ex-editor in my case is actually looking for. So I'd like to cover what editors want from a peer review, what makes a good peer review, and then how you might respond to peer review comments. So Jenna's done a really good outline of how she conducts a review, but I think sometimes we need to think about how best we respond to the comments as well. So what am I looking for? So it's really important as an editor to make an informed choice about whether or not to accept or reject the paper. And I think particularly for ECRs, it's really important to understand that you've been asked to review because you have experience in the area. So what we want is your considered opinion, and it is really important. It's no less important than anybody else's. So it's vital that you spend your time really constructing a reasoned argument and giving as much feedback as possible. And I'm looking for feedback on the importance of the topic, the scientific design, and the structure of the paper. And I'm really trying to say, well, look, is this fixable? If it is fixable, how do we fix it? And if it's not, then please tell us. So, in terms of the first bit, importance of the field, does this actually advance what we already know? So in order to answer that, you might need to briefly summarize how much is already known. So is this new knowledge, or is this just an accumulation? Both are important. So if you're telling us information about a new subgroup or in a different sample, that's fine, but justify where that fits within the rest of the literature. And your job as a reviewer is to kind of pull out that evidence. Also, are there different or better tools? So if somebody's previously used a self-report measure and you've got an objective measure, make sure that that comes out, and as a reviewer you're able to kind of say, well, here's how it moves the field forward, or here's how it replicates a previous study. So replication is really important, but obviously at some point we need to move beyond just doing similar designs and onto the synthesis of the evidence via meta-analysis. So we need to kind of pull those bits out. A key thing to remember is don't assume that the editor knows all the things that you know, right? So as a peer reviewer, you have the expertise. At IJBNPA, we were getting somewhere in the region of 800 to 1,000 papers a year. I'd probably be making decisions on about 500. There's no possible way that I can know all the topics within that area. So I really have to rely on high quality reviewers to tell me the things that I don't know. So it's really important that you, as the ECRs and the reviewers, really know the importance of your voice, and that your knowledge is probably more specific than the editor on that specific topic. Equally, that means if you've been asked to review something that you don't know anything about, then please reject, or say, I don't know anything about this, because actually a review from somebody that doesn't have any expertise in the area is probably not that helpful. So then on to the scientific design. I want to know, is the study design appropriate? So all designs have limitations, but have they been appropriately recognized? Could an alternative design have been used? And if not, why was it not used? There may be a very valid reason, but that's what I want you to kind of pull out as a reviewer. Well, they've used this method, they could have used this alternative one, and they haven't said why they did that. Are there things that could be done with the data analysis? So a new analysis or a different technique that's better or superior than the approach that they've taken? Just be careful when you propose this, though, because it's some reviewers will often suggest a different technique or different analysis, and actually that answers a different question. So what you're looking for is the best technique or best method for the technique the question that's being posed. So it's really important that you kind of don't just invent new research questions for the authors, but actually help them to answer the research question the best that they can. In terms of structure, does the introduction and background make the case for the question posed? Sometimes people will write 8-page introductions, sometimes people will write 2-paragraph introductions. I normally think that it's about a 3 to 4 paragraph is what you're looking for, which means the authors need to very tightly construct the rationale for what they're doing. But is there a rationale for this argument? You know, so because have they made a case for why the study needs to be needed? Are the results reported in a clear and consistent manner? So can you follow the tables? Do you understand what they mean? Or have you had to spend multiple reads of them? If you've had to spend multiple reads unpacking what a table tells you, it's not good enough, and it needs to be redone in a different way. And then think about reporting guidelines, so Prisma, Strobe, Consort, Tidier. Have they been followed? Are they clearly signposted? Those are normally kind of signposts to a really well-conducted study. Structure of the paper. Also think about personal bugbear of mine is, are the findings presented on the strength of evidence rather than p-values? If a paper is endlessly telling us that this is significant or that is not significant, it's probably not that helpful. I want to know what the findings mean. So what's the strength of evidence? How strong is the data? And then an interpretation of what the findings mean. And then is the main message based on evidence? So really focus on the question that the authors have posed, not your question. Often reviewers will want to rewrite a paper in a way that they think the question should have been posed. well, that's fine, but that's a separate paper. So I think it's really your job as a reviewer to make sure that you help the author to answer the question that they've posed. So what makes a good reviewer? So Jenna's covered some of this. So on time, mindful of innovation, constructive, organised, thoughtful, and looks at the big picture. So nothing annoys people more than things being late, because then editors have to chase, and all editors are unpaid volunteers. So every time that you're late, they're having to use up more of their time chasing you. If you're going to be late or you need more time, contact the editor before the due date to say so. Often they can extend the deadline if necessary, but that's much easier than submitting a review late. We do keep a track of those as editors, so we do know who writes good reviews. We also know who's on time. We also know how often people reject, and if you reject all the time, we won't ask you anymore because it takes too much time. Think about innovation. So think about how you can excite the readers, and if the paper is doing that, and if it's not, have the authors missed a trick? If there's something else that could be added, or is there a way that they're framing their message that could be improved? Be constructive. Often people only focus on weaknesses of papers. They don't say what the strengths are, and that's often a big gap. So we want to add that in, and also make sure that you propose possible solutions to problems. So don't just say there's this problem, tell us how it could be fixed, and then the editor can pass that back to the authors. Be organised. So use bullet points or numbers, because it makes the author's job of responding much easier, because they can respond to each point in time. And make sure that there's only one issue or comment per bullet point, because often people will conflate lots of ideas in one big paragraph. That makes it very hard to respond. So very kind of point-by-point responses. And then structure based on the sections of the paper. So as Jenna outlined, start with a general kind of gestalt comment of, here's what's good or weak about the paper, and then go section by section. So be thoughtful. So writing three lines saying that the research is great and few edits are needed is not helpful. If that really is the case, then say it, but often it suggests that people haven't really read the paper. Most reviews are about a page, or at least a page. Make sure that you justify your recommendation and keep the big picture in mind. It's okay to comment on writing style or grammar if it improves comprehension, but really it may not be that helpful to have lots of comments about adding commas and apostrophes to line 26 and line 27. What people really want to know is what's the overall focus of the paper, and is it sharing the right message? Make sure that you view it as a way to help the authors articulate their message as well as possible, but it's not your job to rewrite the paper. So it's not your job to rewrite every sentence, and it's not your job to show how much you know. So it's really about trying to be helpful rather than trying to show off. As I said, no short reviews. Equally, a 5-page review is probably not helpful. That probably suggests you've gone too far. So focus on your key message. What's important? How does it contribute to the evidence base? And if it can be fixed, tell us how. So give guidance to the author and the editor about changing particular sections, because that makes it much easier for everybody. And then kind of in terms of writing reviews, be thoughtful, be kind, as Jenna put it. Make sure you have protected time. Think about how you would like to receive feedback. Keep the manuscript confidential. If you've been asked to review, that doesn't mean you can discuss it with every man and his dog. If you are relatively junior, I think it's okay to discuss with your supervisor or mentor. Often you should ask the journal's permission to do that, but really it shouldn't be you talking about the paper endlessly. So it really needs to be kept confidential. And then if you're responding to peer review, I just wanted to put a slide on this. Be respectful to the reviewers. They've given up their time. Respond to all comments. And really, when you do this, restate the comment and then put your response underneath it, often using bullets or subheadings. And if a comment keeps reappearing from multiple peer reviewers, just refer back to the earlier response. And really what we're looking for as editors is to see if you're responsive to comments and whether or not you've reflected and tried to improve. It's okay to rebut, but do it sparingly and make sure that you back up with evidence or facts and do it in a very respectful manner. I'll stop there, Tepi, and leave time for some questions.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Yeah, definitely from a different perspective there. We do have some questions, so we might go to Jenna first. So Rachel's collated some together, so if you want to go first there.
So I'm going to ask Jenna a question first. So thanks, Jenna. It was a really great overview and really detailed for PhD students and early career researchers. The one question I had is, it sounds like a really time-consuming process, which may be daunting to people. So you talked about that on average you take about 2 to 3 days to do a review. Was that initially, or does it take you that long now? I'm just thinking, you suggested maybe approximately 12 reviews a year if you were first authoring 6 papers, which could be like 24 to 36 days. So can you just talk about, I guess, speeding up that process and how long it's taken you to do that?
Yeah, so I should probably just clarify at this point. When I'm talking about the 2 to 3 days, for me, that's really just time to reflect. So I might do a revision or do a peer review on that first day, but before I submit it, I'm really giving myself a little bit of time to reflect on what my comments were and what my thoughts were around that paper and what I felt were the weaknesses, just to make sure that I'm confident in that decision and in that feedback. So for me, I guess when I first started, I might have been taking maybe around 4 hours to review that first paper, but to me that really depends on the context of that paper. So I find it quicker to review a revised manuscript than an initial first read of the manuscript, because you're really having to understand it in depth from the beginning. I think it's also maybe it'll depend on how well the paper's written. So if the paper's written really well, it might be easier to read. You might have to spend less time, where if it's not as well written, you might need to spend more time trying to understand the points that they're putting forward, but also how well you understand the topic. And I think for me, as I said, probably in the beginning, it was taking me 3 or 4 hours to review a manuscript, and then I'd spend a couple of days reflecting on that before I'd submit it. But in the long term, it's gotten a lot quicker with more practice. So for some papers now, it only takes me an hour.
Great. Thank you. And so, Russ, I had another question for you, if that's okay.
Yeah.
You talked about that that there is potential to extend the deadline for review. So I think that probably is a great for us to know, that who've been asked about how much time is reasonable. So if I wrote in and said I'd love to review the paper, but I've got commitments at the moment, is it my job to let you know when I could have a review back by, or would the journal let us know what was reasonable?
So normally the author or the reviewer would make a suggestion. So they'd say, I can't get to it by X, but I could give you a review that's perhaps a week later or 10 days later. And then it's the editor's decision about how fast they need the review for that paper. So sometimes you need a rapid decision if something has to happen by a particular deadline in order to be published on a particular day. But generally a week or so's delay is probably helpful. But so I think it's up to the reviewer to make a suggestion to the editor or the editorial office. And normally, and that applies equally to if you can't do a revision on a manuscript as an author by a set date, then rather than miss the deadline, go back to the editorial office and say, I can't do it by X, can I have a week's extension? And most journals are pretty flexible as long as there's an ongoing dialogue.
That's great. Thank you. And maybe my third question is one that both of you could respond to and answer together just off your own knowledge. Is there a quick checklist that people could use to assist them in peer reviewing? Do you know of any checklists out there that are available or been published that we could use?
My quick answer would be no. I think some journals have specific ones, but it very much depends on the type of paper that's being submitted. So I think if you're reviewing a trial paper, then it would be helpful to look at the consort checklist. If you're reviewing a systematic review, having an eye on the PRISMA guidelines. If you're doing a cohort study, the STROBE guidelines. So those kind of published reporting guidelines are often useful in terms of reviewing a paper, but I don't know of very specific ones for journals. I don't know if Jenna has different experiences.
Yeah, so I have actually found a few journals that do have specific checklists. So I think Elsevier and maybe Wiley or a few have different suggestions of peer reviewing checklists, but when I've looked over them, I wouldn't suggest that they are very comprehensive, and they tend to sometimes be a little bit broad and provide different kind of areas to focus on. So I have looked over them just to give me a general guide on what kind of things I should be considering when I'm reading a manuscript, but I don't solely use one particular checklist to actually peer review the article. I guess I'm trying to reflect on all different questions and things I should be considering when making that review, not just looking at one checklist.
Great, thank you. Thanks for both of your presentations. They were, it was really good to hear from both perspectives.
All right, so if no one else has got anything to add there, I'll just thank both of our speakers today for excellent presentations, and just remind everyone that it will be available on the ISBNPA and ISPAH pages in a couple of days' time. So thank you again, Russ, and thanks, Jenna.
Okay, bye.
Bye.